Okay, let's move on to the subject matter of today, and that's going to be this thing we call space. Actually, not space. It's a portion of space which they call place, more known as void. I call it position, which is what the mathematicians used to call it. Now they don't use that word position anymore. But they're all the same. They're all synonyms. Why was this important? Because the Greeks started out on the wrong foot. Obviously, they were so backward, they could just barely think. And they were the first people to try to think these things out, okay? So they made a lot of errors, okay? We can excuse them for that, okay? But none of them, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, all of these folks out there, Democritus, none of them figured it out. None of them figured any of this out. All they could do is try to imagine how all this could work. And they got everything wrong. And they got it all wrong because they could not see the invisible, intangible mediators that Mother Nature uses. That was the whole problem. And that's still the whole problem today. Nothing has changed in 2,500 years. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is look at the words that mathematics uses, which they never defined, and which are absolutely essential to do physics. You cannot do physics unless you lay this foundation, which is the foundations of the proper language to do physics. Okay, and so here it is. These are words that the mathematicians never defined. That's a mathematician down here at the bottom, by the way. Fundamental concepts that have stumped and baffled the mathematicians throughout the ages. Space. No one has any idea what space is. They don't know how to define it. They don't know what it is. They have opinions, and they don't have a proper notion of what space is. But the one we're going to talk about today is position. The Greeks called it place, or at least it was translated as place, so we got to go with that word. Call it position. Point. Nobody knows what a point is. You make a dot on the board, or with your chalk, or with a crayon, you do it on a piece of paper, and you say that's a point. Well, I'm staring at a dot. That's a dot. Yeah, but you should not confuse the dot with a point. Oh, okay, so what's a point? That's what's objectively in front of me. So what's this point thingy? It's a location. So what was the purpose of the dot? Well, it was to give a pictorial representation of a location. So we have irrationality because they're using the heart to represent love. And they're saying, we're going to be moving love. What do you mean you're going to be moving love? You can move the heart, but if you're going to talk about love, get rid of the heart and let's talk about love. And this is the same thing. They put a point, meaning a dot. That's what they draw. That's what's objectively in front of your eyes. But then they say, well, we have so many locations. Then they deal with the concept location, forget about the dot altogether. And so this is why they can't define the word point today, because they took an object, they mixed it with a concept, and they said it's a point. It's a dot location. Location dot location, location dot. It's a point. That's what a point is, a dot location. Okay, that's the problem. It's a heart love. That's what a point is. It's very easy to define a point. You either have the object known as dot, or you have the concept known as location. And if you're going to use location, it's a concept, and you should use the concept. Why use this new word called point? Use the word location if that's what you're going to talk about. Very simple. Okay, it's the language that confuses and drives all these mathematicians out, nuts. Okay, we have location, same thing. Nobody defined that. Distance, nobody knows what a distance is. Everybody confuses distance with distance traveled, with displacement, and with length. They say, what is the distance? Distance is the length of blah, 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 blah. What is the length? It's the distance of blah, 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 blah. And they're not talking about neither distance or length. They're talking about distance traveled. What they're doing is unrolling the measuring tape, and they take the tip of the measuring tape, and they say, okay, it's so many meters, so many feet, or whatever, so many miles from the tip of the measuring tape to where I started. So they count. What is a mathematician interested in? He's only interested in numbers and units and quantities. He's not interested in the physical aspect. And so that's the problem. Distance is separation. We don't need any numbers to talk about distance, not in physics. Okay, distance traveled. Well, you can have a qualitative also. Distance traveled, you say, okay, there's so much separation after you unroll the tape. You don't need to have units there either. It's displacement. That's when you start putting numbers in there. Okay, that's when they said we need to put numbers and units in there. Okay, and of course they confuse it with a line because they draw a little stick and they say that's a line. It's one-dimensional, which I forgot to mention. The point is also zero-dimensional. They say actually it's non-dimensional because it's a concept. But here with a line, the same thing. They say it's one-dimensional. It's made out of zero-dimensional points. What? What do you mean? What are you talking about? They're not talking about lines. They're not talking about points. What they're talking about is an itinerary, a trajectory, and they call that a line. Why? Because they replaced it with a stick. Okay, and they call that stick a line. What is a line? It has both worlds. It has the object, the stick, and it has the concept, which is the itinerary, motion, a series of locations, points. And so this is the problem. They're talking about motion, and they put a stick. Now, what sense does that make to represent motion with a stick? Okay, so and then they get confused because they don't know if you're talking about the stick or the itinerary. Okay, and they call it a line. Okay, anyways, dimension, same thing, nonsense. They don't know what a dimension is. Dimension, they say, is a bunch of coordinates, the number of coordinates. No, that's not what a dimension is. Dimension is three mutually perpendicular lines. That's the three-dimension, the definition of three-dimension, and each one of those is known as a dimension. And the dimensions are length, width, and height. Very simple, baby stuff for kindergartners. Physics is for babies. Anyone can understand physics. You don't need to go to college. You don't need to go to high school to understand physics. Physics is intuitive. It's how Mother Nature runs her shop, how Father Universe runs the universe. That's what it's all about. And they never define the two important words, which is the word object and the word exist. Physics cannot be done without objects. If you remove all the objects from the universe, God comes in there and removes everything. You got nothing. Okay, great. Now you have nothing. What's going on? What's happening? You need object. You need things. So you need to define the word object, first word that you need to define in physics. Without the word object, you can't be doing physics. And then exist, physics only deals with those objects that exist. Okay, so you need to define those two words, object and exist. Why do the idiots who call themselves atheists, the idiots who call themselves theists, the idiots who call themselves agnostics, why do these three idiots, these three stooges go around in circles? Well, they go around in circles because they never define the word exist. That's why they go around in circles. That's why I put religious people like theists together with atheists, together with agnostics. They all should be executed. Every single one of them. That means 99% plus of humanity. Because they don't even know what they're talking about. You have to define the word exist if you're going to talk about God. Very simple. If you don't know what the word exist means, then one guy says, well, I believe God exists. The other guy says, oh, no, I know God doesn't exist. And the other guy says, well, I don't know if he exists or not. I don't know what test I can run. Maybe I should run an experiment to prove the existence of God. No, kill them all. All three stooges. Just kill them all. Get rid of all of them. Okay? And obviously they never defined the word concept. Okay? And so you need to know the difference between an object and a concept. And people don't understand that. They think field is a physical object. They think energy is a physical object. Absolutely not. Those are concepts. There's no physical object in physics called energy. Nothing called field. No physical object called field. And it takes 10 years for a mathematician to understand what I just said, to understand the difference between an object and a concept. And of course, no one did that in the last 10,000 years. Okay, so how did the Greeks start? Well, they thought there was this ether between the moon and the earth. Okay, all that black stuff out there, they said it's ether. It was like an air of the gods. Okay, and so this is more or less the notion that they had. You had the earth there surrounded by water, surrounded by air, surrounded by fire, and then the ether came. And in the Middle Ages, they had that notion there where they have the guy sticking his neck out, I guess, to space between the earth and the moon, and that was the ether in there. All we needed to do is color code it, and we would have been fine. Okay, so here we have it. We start with the ether, but you would think that the Greeks would have said, okay, what's out there? You know, what is that black stuff? And they said it's ether. Okay, but what is the ether? What are we talking about? And so they imagined it as air, because that's essentially what the word ether means. It's a sort of godly air. And what's the air? A bunch of particles. So they were thinking of a bunch of particles. The black stuff is also a bunch of particles, much like air, but it's a different type of air. So when the gods breathe, Zeus, you know. Okay, so that was the starting point. But they had different schools to analyze this word void, this word place. They called it place. I guess they called it place because that's how it's translated, okay? Maybe they meant something else. But I think more or less they were talking about the same thing. Void, place, position, all those were synonyms. They were talking about that, and you're going to see that in how they defended their arguments, okay? So these were the different Greek schools, okay? I'm not going to go through all of them, but here you can see, you know, the main ones and where more or less these folks were located. This was the Greek world, okay? And you have different schools in different places, okay? And we're going to look at some of these fellows, okay? We're going to find out what the schools or what each individual thought about, or how they thought, especially about void, space, nothingness. Was there a nothingness? Does nothingness exist? is it a physical object? Is it nothing? And if so, what is nothing? So you need to define these terms to be able to talk rationally. And the big problem we have is no one ever defined it. Nobody ever figured out what space is to this day, okay, as we're going to see here. Okay, so here we have good old Airy, okay? And what did he say? Okay, so he starts trying to figure out the void, okay? So he says, the physicist must have a knowledge of place. He needs to know what place means, the site occupied by an object, the volume, whichever way you want to see it, the volume of space. But it's like you take a chunk of space out of space. You say, that chunk, we're going to call that place. Why place? Because it's the site occupied by an object. Okay, that was the notion. As well as the infinite, again, mathematicians, namely whether there is such a thing, or not, and the manner of its existence. They were talking about, is it a thing? And if it is a thing, does it exist? Did they define what a thing is? Did they define what exist means? Absolutely not. And those were the two key words, okay? And what it is, both because, and I like this, because this is just genial, okay? It says, things which exist are somewhere. Airy said that, 350 BC. Things that exist are somewhere. That is the definition of exist, more or less, and no one has ever discovered it. No one ever used it. Airy doesn't even know what he said. He has no idea what he just said there. He said something tremendously important. Things which exist are somewhere, and non-existent is nowhere. An object that exists is an object that has location. That's the definition of exist. Now we can use that word consistently in an argument, in a debate, in a dissertation, whatever. Now you can talk about God. Does God exist? Well, let's look at the definition. What is the definition? Object that has location. First step, is God an object? Is God a thing, or is it a concept? If God is a concept like love, intelligence, grace, then God cannot exist by definition. The definition requires that it's an object if it wants to exist. The table I have in my head, dreaming, thinking of, that one doesn't exist because it doesn't have location. This table does exist because it has location. Well, there's distance between the table and my chest, between the table and the walls. So there's distance. The set of distances, location. Now we have an object that has location. We can say that by definition, pursuant to the definition, the table exists. We have to do the same thing with God. Does God exist? Is God an object or a concept? Well, he's made in our image, so I guess he's an object. Yeah, then all he's got to do now is have location. He's got to have distance between God and me. God can hide in the 10th dimension if he wants, but there better be a line of direction from him directly to me. I don't care where he hides in the universe or outside the universe. There's got to be a straight line of direction from me to him. Period. We're done. And otherwise he doesn't exist, because that's what the word exist means. That's how it's defined scientifically. Okay? And so, if God is a concept, he can't exist. Does space-time exist? Well, space and time are concepts. Space is a synonym of nothing, and time is a concept, obviously. I'm not going to go into details there, but space-time is a concept, so it doesn't exist by definition. So we can't talk about, you can't use it in science to say that this inexistent space-time is what prevents the Earth from flying out of the solar system. Only idiots use that kind of language. Okay, the question, what is place, presents many difficulties. Yeah, no kidding. But I like what he said next. He said, moreover, we have inherited nothing from previous thinkers. He was criticized. Remember, he's talking 350 years before Christ. So he's talking about the guys that came before him. Plato, Socrates, Pythagoras. He's got all these guys behind him. And he says, none of them gave us any idea. None of these so-called thinkers, okay, he inherited nothing from them. So he's accusing them. And so here we have the first one. He goes, again, I'm not going to go through all the schools. Here we go to Anaxagoras, okay? And so he analyzes what Anaxagoras said. And so he says the following. He says, Anaxagoras does not disprove what people really mean by void does not exist, but only their erroneous way of speaking. In other words, he was saying it was a semantic issue, okay? That he was just criticizing the way they were phrasing the existence of the void, okay? And he says, merely gives an ingenious demonstration that air is something showing the resistance of the air. So if you move your hand and you feel the air, okay, you feel resistance there, you feel something there, you're touching something that you can't see, by the way. Again, object is not that which you can see or touch. You can't see the air, but hopefully air is an object, a thing, Okay, anything made out of atoms had better be a thing. Okay, and so he says void does not exist. But he shows it through the air, through the fact that there's air wherever you think there is void. That was essentially Anaxagoras' way of thinking. But people really mean that there is an empty interval in which there is no sensible body. In other words, what Aristotle was saying that Anaxagoras' reasoning is wrong. It's irrational. He's saying, Anaxagoras says, look, there's air, so there can't be void because there's air where you think there is nothing. And he says that's wrong because that only proves the existence of air. It doesn't prove the non-existence of void, okay, of nothing. Okay, he says you have to show that there is an interval where there is no matter, including air. That's what Ari is trying to, that's where he's criticizing about Anaxagoras. It is not then the existence of air that needs to be proved. Again, mathematicians always talk about proof. They prove everything, then they don't know anything. But the non-existence of an interval, okay, different from the bodies. In other words, you have a body, and you have to show that between two bodies, there's absolutely nothing. So he's going to try to prove this, okay? And again, it's important to know that all these people were trying to figure out, in a way, space. What is space? Is there something, that black stuff out there? And they all started looking at position, at what happens when you move something out of position. And they said, is there something that occupies that same position once you pull that thing out? If you pull the chair out, what fills the void? And Anaxagoras would say air fills it. Okay, that was his answer. And Aristotle says, yeah, but you got to do it without air. You got to show that when you pull the chair out, nothing, absolutely nothing remains behind. So you have this volume of chair left behind, that nothing fills it, that sort of thing. That's what he was getting to. Okay, so here we have the Iliatics, okay, and what these people primarily was, he analyzes Melissus, but the first guy was probably Zeno there, and Parmenides, one of those two was the first one. They're not sure because they don't have the exact dates, but as far as I know, Zeno was really the first guy to create this Iliatic school. Again, these schools were spread around in the Greek Empire. And what do they believe in, or what was their argument? It says, all is immovable. They didn't believe in motion. What do you mean you don't believe in motion? How can that possibly be? Of course there's motion. Look, I'm moving my hand. And they say, no, there is no motion. You say, how can they conclude such a irrationality? And these folks had this idea that if you move your hand and you leave a void behind, then the void exists. There is a thing called void that has shape. That's where your hand was. And they said that can't be. There's no such thing as a void of hand, or a void that's shaped like your hand, a volume that's left behind. There's no such thing. And so there is no motion because you can only move to where there's void, okay? But all voids are filled. That was more or less their argument. They said there is no change. Yeah, just like you're listening. That's how these people concluded. They're famous for that. Okay, so what the atomists, primarily Democritus, and I guess it was his teacher Leucippus, okay, and they were from up north in Thrace, okay, right north of Greece, okay, and so they brushed aside all these Iliatics. They say they're all crazy, okay, and what was their argument? They say Democritus and Leucippus hold that there is an interval which divides the whole body so as to break its continuity, okay, so that you have if you move something, like you separate an apple, okay? You separate an apple, and these folks said when you separate the two halves, you're leaving a void behind. There has to be a void behind. And the other fellow say, no, you can't, because one guy said you're moving it into a void, and there is no such thing as void. That's the first one. And the other guy said, as soon as you separate them, air fills the void instantaneously. So you never have void, you never have separation. But these guys were criticizing the Iliatics, saying, you're crazy. What do you mean there's no motion? Of course there's motion, and we're not even going to talk to you anymore. So they blocked them. That's how the Greeks used it. They invented blocking. Okay, so what does he say about Pythagoras, another school? Okay, Ari says, Pythagoras held that void exists. Void exists. Did they define exist? No. Did they define what an object is? No. Exist can only be an object that has location. You heard Arius say something similar, okay? And so these guys are saying the void exists. That means he's saying that a void is an object, okay? And that it enters the heaven itself, which as it were inhales it from the infinite air, okay? So The gods, they breathe all this good stuff. That's when they invented drugs, I think. Okay, here we have another analysis. He um, analyzes his boss, his previous teacher, Plato. Okay, he did go to the academy. Plato is in the Timaeus says that matter and space are the same. Matter and space, things and nothings are the same. That's what Plato said. Okay, for the participant, meaning space, the thing, okay, and space are identical. So he's saying that when you remove the ball, right, you leave a hole behind in space. He's saying the hole that he left behind and the ball, they're the same thing. Meaning the volumes are the same thing. Meaning in mathematics, in the religion of mathematics, it's the same thing. A ball is the same thing as the sphere, as the volume, because they're looking at numbers. They're not looking at qualitative, whether a ball is the same thing as a volume in the middle of space, if you can imagine that. This is the issue. So this is where you get mathematics involved with science. Okay, unfortunately, it really got introduced through geometry. That's where mathematics began. That's when they started using these concepts such as location and itinerary, and confusing it with line and point, meaning stick and dot. That's where the problem began with mathematics. Geometry is the first irrationality in mathematics. Okay, completely irrational. All the definitions are irrational. Okay, so here we have Aries' reasoning for place, for this void. And again, they're not looking at space. Like, what is space? This infinite space that's out there. They weren't looking at that. They said, well, between the moon and the earth, there's this ether, and that was a space, but we don't touch that. What they were looking at is location within here on earth. In other words, they were looking at void. They were looking at position, the volume occupied by an object. That's what they were analyzing. And from there, a lot of people extrapolated, oh, this is the notion they had of space. Okay, so keep in mind, they're talking about a chunk of space and not this gigantic space that, supposedly where matter flows out there in space. Okay, so he says the following. He says, what then after all is place? Place meaning void, meaning volume, etc. Place is what contains that of which it is the place. Okay, place is what an object occupies place, and that's and whatever the object occupies, we'll call that place. Okay, great. Place is no part of the thing. Okay, so he's saying place and thing are two separate things. Okay, the immediate place of a thing is neither less nor greater than the thing. Okay, they have the same volume. Place can be left behind by the thing and be separable. He's saying that you move the ball and you leave place behind. Okay. That was his notion. Again, we're talking about this position that the object occupied, okay, this place, this void. All place admits of the distinction of up and down in each of the bodies is naturally carried to its appropriate place and rests there, okay? And this makes the place either up or down. Okay, so these are the notions that he's going to start with. He's going to start his reasoning. What does good old Airy conclude with? And again, it shows that mathematicians are not called out to ever do physics. Okay, they have no notion of physics, and this is where it started, and where everybody took off from there. The existence of place. He just told me that it's got to be a thing, and he's saying, well, place is a thing. Okay, so I guess that's where his contradiction comes in. He's saying place is a thing, and he's talking about the existence of place. It's held to be obvious. It's obvious. Place exists. We don't need the ball. We have place there, the ball where the ball used to be. From the fact of mutual replacement, the fact that you can replace one thing with another. Okay, he's saying the place is there. The place exists. The void exists. What now contains air, right? You took the ball out. It was filled with air. Contained water. So that, or well, water in this case. So that clearly the place or space into which and out of which they pass was something different from both. So you pull the water out. Air fills it. But water is not the same thing as place. Air is not the same thing as place. So there's this third entity called place, which is separate or distinct from air and water. That's how we started our culture, our mathematics, the religion of mathematics. Okay, irrationality, 150% irrationality. Anything coming out of Cambridge, out of Harvard, out of Caltech, MIT, Oxford, St. Andrews, all of them. All they have is irrationality. From China all the way to the United States, from Russia all the way to South America, from Europe all the way to Africa. All the same. And all PhDs coming out of the university, they just babble nonsense, irrationalities, one right after another. Okay, so let's keep going here. What happens next? Well, we have to wait a few years after that, a few hundred years, right? We get to Newton. I covered that the other day, so I'll go quickly here. The only thing I want to mention here is Newton separated place from position. And he says there at the bottom, position's property have no quantity. So he's saying that position is a qualitative notion. It's like the volume occupied by an object. Whereas he's saying that place, I guess, is associated with numbers. Again, this distinction that only mathematicians notice, because in physics we don't care about any of that. Okay, it's nonsense, poppycock. Okay, so here we have guys who came a little later than, I know, first we have a fight between Newton and Leibniz, and they had two different notions of what space is out there. We're talking about this so-called absolute space, whether you can gauge your position with respect to this immovable space. Can you use it as a reference? Is there a border to space? Does space have a surface? Like if it were a sphere, does it have a surface like that in that sense? And these two had two different ideas. And remember, they fought over the calculus. Here they're going to fight also over what space is. And here's the two versions. Here you have Leibniz, and he says, space doesn't exist independently of things. If God destroyed all matter, space would cease to exist. In other words, he's saying that you need things to conceptualize space. What does Newton say? He says, space is an immense container. He sees it as a container. He's talking about absolute space here, this big space in which all galaxies, stars, planets, etc. are in, right? Objects gauge their movements with respect to it. And if God destroyed all matter, space would still continue to exist. Okay, so again, these people never define what an object is. They never define the word exist. And so they're talking about the existence of a concept, the universe or space. Neither universe nor space exist, because universe is a concept, and we'll see in a minute, and space is a concept. Space is a synonym of nothing, and nothing is what? That which has no shape. And we'll get to that in a second as well. Okay, but here, let's continue. Here we have two guys that came right after that, short while after that, not quite 100 years, but we have David Hume and Immanuel Kant. And Hume says the following, says, space does not exist independently of objects. Again, we hear that over and over. Can't be conceived in the absence of objects. What is he doing? He's introducing the observer. He's saying that space has something to do with the observer. Space can't be separated from sensations and touch, for example. Right? And objects separated by distance are equal or the same as objects separated by invisible, intangible objects. Talking about the rope, I guess that, okay? No, it's not the same thing. If they're separated by distance, they're separated by nothing, meaning by space. And if they're separated by invisible, intangible objects, such as the rope, then they are separated by an object. So David Hume could see the objects, and that's why he had to reach such an irrational conclusion. Space is not infinitely divisible, okay? And then Kant says something different. He says, can't imagine, okay, the absence of space, okay? He can imagine the absence of objects, but he cannot imagine the absence of space. But he's wrong, because, see, you can imagine the absence of space. Let's assume God came in with his magic wand and erased space, somehow removed space. We don't care how he does a magic trick. He removes space. Well, then you would have an infinite block of matter. That's what you would have. So yes, you can imagine the absence of space. It would be a single block of matter, an infinite block of matter, which would be a contradiction with the definition of the word object, which is that which has shape, and an infinite whatever does not have shape. Okay, so he says infinite space, Newton's absolute space, that's what he was referring to, right, when he talks about infinite space, is no more than an abstraction, not worth losing any sleep over. Just a concept humans invented to make sense of the separation, for example, the Earth and the Moon. So this is these are the conclusions these folks reach, in great measure because they never define the word object, the word exist, and of course the word space. Because if you are going to talk about space or void or position or volume, first thing you should do is define the term so that you know what you're talking about. But these people use irrational, what are they called? These definitions that they develop through the theory. Okay, they tell it to you at the end of the theory. Okay. And so, yeah, you can't use those definitions. Can't remember the name of it right now. Okay, so here we go with what space is today, what these people think of space today. And this fellow who criticized me, he essentially goes with these notions of space, time, etc. And these are statements that I got out there, and you can search from, from people who make them, and they're usually PhDs, so you're not talking about just an ordinary Joe out there in the streets. Space-time is one big container, and all of us move around in it. Yeah, is space-time a container? Is that what space is? Is that what time is? A container? And we move around in it, meaning we can gauge our position, our location with respect to the edges of space-time because it's a big container. And obviously they'll never tell you what's outside of it because that's where the intelligence stops. And then the next one says space and time are effectively interchangeable and fundamentally the same thing. So they say time and space are the same thing. Yeah, and he's not, whoever said that was not the first one to say it. You'll look at Stephen Hawking, he says the same nonsense. Why posit a giant entity that acts like a container if we don't have to? And yeah, you'll hear the statement, empty space. It's like saying empty, empty, like Humpty Dumpty, empty, empty. That's what you're saying, or space, space, or nothing, nothing. Space is empty. It's nothing. So to say empty space, what are you talking about? Space is empty. And so they stopped using the word place, but it's essentially the notion of void, of empty. But these notions, both void and empty, means that there is no object there. Okay, and again, that's not what space is. Space is not the absence of objects. You do not define space by saying no object, no nothing, no thing there. That's not the definition of space, because then what is an object? Well, it's the no space there. You just go back and forth. You can go around in circles. Never define words with their negative. A cat is not. You don't define a cat as not a dog, and you don't define a dog as not a cat. No, those are not definitions of dog and cat. Okay. And here you have what they use today, the notion of position. It's no longer the position in the sense the volume occupied by an object. What it has been relegated to essentially is the location of an object with respect to a center. In other words, position really is a distance traveled. It's motion. There's no difference between position and motion in the religion of mathematics. Okay, a Euclidean vector. What is a vector? Magnitude and direction. So they're talking about motion, right? That represents the position. I like that. The position is the position. Great. Of a point P in space in relation to an arbitrary reference origin O. Okay. In other words, they're talking about what? Order pair. An order pair. That's what they're talking about. In other words, it is the displacement. What? What is position? Displacement. Or translation. What is position? Translation. Movement. There's no difference between position and motion. That maps the origin to P. Okay, so yeah, this is the notion that they ended up with. They ended up with this nonsense because in the religion of mathematics, they don't care about qualitative stuff. So for them, position and motion are synonym. Displacement is the same thing. Distance is the same thing as distance traveled as length. They're all the same. Why? Because they're going to unroll the measuring tape. They're going to look at the tip of the measuring tape, how much it moved from beginning to end. And they're going to put a number followed by a unit, a quantity. That's what all these things are. They're all the same because that's what they can put in an equation. It's got nothing to do with reality, with the world of physics, which is qualitatively, exclusively qualitative. And these people are looking for, to putting stuff in their equations. For that, they have to measure, they have to observe, go to the lab. And so while they're there, they say, well, let's see if we can find out what gravity is. Yeah, unseeable and untouchable mediators of gravity, they're going to discover it in the lab. Sure. I'll give you the rest of the year to do it. I'll give you 100 years, 400 years. Okay, and today we have a, what is it? We have a void in space. We have a little void in space, and it's known as a black hole. It looks like this, okay? And yeah, you can have that little hole in space, and they call that a black hole. And it doesn't look very black because what's black is on the outside. Space is what looks black, dark or whatever. But they call that a black hole. And what is a black hole? A singularity. It's a little hole that they drilled through space, which is nothing. So they're drilling a hole through nothing, okay, which is that which has no shape. And they build these wormholes that go to other universes, which I don't know what they're separated from our universe with. I mean, what separates our universe from theirs? If our universe contains space, time, and matter, as they say, and their universe contains space, time, and matter, what is the wormhole through? What is this little hole the entrance to? And what is the outlet through? What is this wormhole, which is like a tunnel? What is that through? What's the medium it's through? I mean, I can ask Bugs Bunny there, where is his hole? He can say it's in the earth. So the hole is a concept, really, right? but it's an opening in the earth. We call that a hole. Well, what's the black hole? What's it into? Space, nothing, that which has no shape. And it goes, you come out of another universe, out of another black hole over there, I guess, or white hole maybe, you know. So we have this little tunnel through what? Through space, through nothing. Great. Great. So, okay, so here are the conclusions, okay, for today. Position, place, it's the object itself. That's what it is in science. So we don't use the words position, place, the volume. We don't care about any of those because all those are the object itself. That's it, period. We're done. Okay? And that's what all these people, the Greeks especially, you know, they've been running around in circles talking about whether if you move the ball out of the space, is there something filling it? Was there a hole there to begin with that it occupied to begin with, you know? And does it exist? You know, so they went around in circles because they never defined the terms. All they had to do is define position as the object itself, and we don't need the word position at all, or place, or void. We don't need any of those words at all. What is void? Void is the same thing as empty. When you say void, you mean that you subtracted something from it. Empty means also that you took something out. That's the notion that the word empty and void mean. Absence of something. That's not equal to space. That's not the definition of space. Okay? Object is a thing. What is it? That which has shape. What is space? Nothing. The opposite. No thing. Nothing. That which has no shape. Now we can use these words consistently in a dissertation. We have something and we have nothing. What is something? That which has shape. What is nothing? That which doesn't have shape. We're done. Very simple, baby stuff. You don't even need to go to high school to learn this stuff. 10-year-old can learn this. Space is the antonym of an object. They're antonyms, okay? Opposites. Matter, objects that exist. So if you take the collection of objects in the universe that exist, or within a system, a subsystem you can take also as well. But matter refers to all objects that exist. What is an object that exists? An object that has location. Okay, so if the object has location, set of distances to all other objects, then it exists by definition. Not because you believe, not because you know, not because you can prove or run an experiment, because it meets the definition. Period. We're done. It's pursuant to the definition. You don't believe in chairs. You don't believe in balls or in trees. And you should not believe in God. And you should not know God or disbelieve in God or disbelieve in chair or disbelieve in tree. Okay? You define the word exist and you say, what is exist? It's a thing, yeah, that which has shape, that has location, the set of distances. Does the tree meet the definition? The tree exists by definition whether I believe or not. Does God exist? Well, is God a physical object? Yes, God is a physical object. Okay, then he can exist. He can exist. He may exist. He's allowed to exist. He still needs to meet the second condition, which is there separation between him and me? Does he have location? If God doesn't have location, he doesn't exist. And if he's a concept, he doesn't even qualify for the first part. Universe is a concept. No such physical object called universe. People say, oh, the universe, it's infinite. No such monster as infinite objects, first of all. But universe is not an object. Universe is a concept. Why? Because it has two things, or things treated as a things momentarily. Space here is treated as a thing. We're saying two things. We're comparing two things. We're saying matter and space. We're saying space is not like matter. Matter is not like space. So we have two things, and therefore it's a concept. What is a concept? It's a word that invokes two objects. All concepts invoke two objects. It's a relation between two objects. That's what a concept is. Universe is a relation between matter and space. Therefore, universe is a concept. Universe cannot be said to exist because it's not an object. Only objects may be said to exist pursuant to the definition. We're done.